My name is Mia Mason. I am 28 years old. For the last 5 years, my parents told our entire extended family that I had vanished in the middle of the night. They claimed I was struggling with hidden demons. They told church congregations I had been lured away by a dangerous group. They printed glossy flyers with my face on them. They hosted annual prayer vigils in their living room. They wiped tears away on camera and collected search funds from sympathetic neighbors. They did all of this while knowing exactly where I really was. I was sitting in a windowless apartment in Omaha, Nebraska. I was eating canned soup and sleeping with a chair wedged under the door handle. I was in the Federal Witness Protection Program, preparing to testify in a cartel money laundering trial. Yesterday, the trial officially ended. The verdicts were delivered. The federal gag order was lifted. Today, I put on a crisp white linen dress. I wanted to wear something bright, something that defied the dirty runaway narrative my parents had carefully constructed for me. I drove to a rented park pavilion in Naples, Florida, where 40 of my relatives were gathered for the annual summer reunion. The air under the aluminum roof was thick with humidity and the smell of burning charcoal. A country song played from a portable speaker by the buffet tables. I walked across the damp grass and stepped onto the concrete pad. I did not announce myself. I just stood there and waited for the lie to expire. Aunt Vivian saw me first. She was carrying a large porcelain platter of deviled eggs. She stopped mid-stride. Her fingers went loose. The platter hit the concrete. The sharp crack of breaking china pierced through the music. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. 40 heads turned in unison. My mother Brenda was standing near the coolers. She had been laughing, holding a plastic cup of white wine. Around her neck rested the heavy sapphire pendant I had purchased for her 50th birthday with my first corporate bonus. Her laugh died in her throat. The color drained from her face, leaving only the harsh pink of her lipstick. She looked at me as if the ground had opened up and ruined her afternoon. Beside her, my father Richard lowered his beer bottle. He did not step forward to embrace the daughter he had mourned so loudly. His eyes darted past me toward the parking lot. He looked like a man calculating his chances of outrunning a crisis. Welcome to Aura Vengeance. This is the space for those who have carried the weight of family secrets until the silence became a weapon. How old were you when you realized the people who raised you were the ones you needed protection from? Drop your age in the comments and make sure to subscribe. You will want to stay for this one. My parents had every reason to measure the distance to their cars. The heavy silence under that pavilion was not just about a ghost showing up to lunch. It was about the tall man standing 2 steps behind my right shoulder. Special Agent Davis wore a gray suit that seemed immune to the Florida heat. He kept his hands loosely clasped in front of him. He carried a thick blue folder. My mother finally found her voice. She forced a wet, trembling smile and took a tentative step forward, preparing to perform the role of the overwhelmed, grieving mother one last time. But to understand why I refused to let her touch me and why I brought federal law enforcement to a family barbecue, you have to rewind to a Friday afternoon 5 years ago. 5 years ago, I was 23 years old and living in a high-rise overlooking the gray waters of Biscayne Bay. I owned a sleek 2-bedroom condo in Brickell. I did not inherit the property. I did not rely on trust funds or parental generosity. I paid the mortgage through an unyielding, grueling dedication to forensic accounting. While my older sister Harper spent her 20s asking our parents to fund luxury vacations and lease luxury cars, I spent my time untangling corporate tax fraud. I was the quiet workhorse of the Mason family, the reliable daughter, the one who required zero maintenance and asked for nothing. I operated under the assumption that hard work offered a shield against the chaos of the world. My firm handled high-stakes audits for regional corporations. I wore tailored navy suits. I arrived at my desk by 6 in the morning. I drank black coffee and let the numbers tell me the truth about human nature. Numbers do not possess the capacity to lie. They only reveal the lies people try to hide. My father, Richard, ran a regional pool supply distribution center in Broward County. The business was always hovering on the edge of insolvency. His warehouse smelled perpetually of industrial chlorine and damp cardboard. Whenever I visited, he complained about overhead costs and shrinking profit margins. Yet he still found the capital to float Harper a down payment on a new SUV or fund my mother's frequent trips to the Bahamas. I never questioned the math of my own family. That was my first mistake. During my second year at the firm, Richard brought a new client to my managing partner. It was a mid-sized logistics and freight company operating out of the Port of Miami. My father praised their operation. He claimed their executives were honest, hard-working professionals. He promised their ledgers were impeccable. Because he vouched for them, I volunteered to handle their quarterly audit. I spent 3 weeks reviewing their manifests. I recall sitting at my desk late one Tuesday, analyzing shipping logs. I noticed a recurring discrepancy. Richard's company regularly used this logistics firm to transport bulk pool chemicals. The invoices listed standard 50-pound buckets of industrial shock. But the highway weigh station tickets registered those exact pallets at nearly double the expected cargo weight. At the time, I dismissed it. I flagged it as a clerical error caused by a lazy dock worker. I adjusted the spreadsheet and moved on. I should have paid closer attention to the physics of those heavy pallets. The truth finally surfaced on a Friday afternoon in late October. Rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of my office. Most of my colleagues had already left for the weekend. The floor was quiet, save for the hum of the servers. I was running a final pivot table on the logistics company's offshore vendor accounts. A single string of routing numbers caught my attention. It was a ghost transaction. Money moving from a shell company in the Cayman Islands into a domestic real estate holding firm, then trickling down into the logistics company's payroll accounts. I traced the thread. I spent 4 hours digging through layered digital archives. The sum amounted to $4,200,000. It was not a tax avoidance scheme. It was structuring. The architecture of the transactions matched a known money laundering pipeline used by the Delgado cartel. My throat went dry. The chill of the air conditioning suddenly felt sharp against my neck. The math sat glowing on my monitor, undeniable and lethal. I printed the ledger. I walked down the hall and handed the physical papers to my managing partner. He took one look at the routing numbers and picked up his phone to call the regional director of the FBI. The federal response moved with a speed that defied comprehension. There were no sirens. There was no dramatic raid. At exactly 4:30 in the afternoon, the elevator doors chimed. 3 men wearing dark, unbranded windbreakers walked onto the floor. Agent Davis led the group. He walked straight to my desk. He did not ask if I was Mia Mason. He knew. He instructed me to stand up. I reached for my leather purse. He put his hand over mine and shook his head. He told me to leave the purse. He told me to leave my car keys, my laptop, and my jacket. He said the person who owned those things did not exist anymore. I was escorted through the service elevator down to the underground parking garage. The air was thick with exhaust fumes and damp concrete. They placed me in the back of a black, armored SUV. The doors locked with a heavy, definitive thud. The tinted windows rendered the outside world a blurred, gray smear. As we merged onto Interstate 95, Agent Davis turned around from the passenger seat. He handed me a thick plastic burner phone. He looked at his watch. "You have 10 minutes, he said. You can call your parents. Tell them you are entering federal protection. Tell them the marshals will brief them on the security protocols. Do not tell them where you are going, because you do not know. When the 10 minutes expire, this phone goes out the window." My hands shook so violently the plastic casing rattled against my teeth. I dialed the landline of my parents' house in Naples. The phone rang 3 times. My mother answered. I could hear the faint sound of a television game show in the background. Her voice was light, casual, unbothered. "Mom," I said. My voice cracked. The reality of the situation crushed the air from my lungs. "Mia," she asked. The lightness vanished. "What is wrong?" I explained everything in fractured, hurried sentences. I told her about the audit, the $4 million, the Delgado cartel. I told her I was sitting in the back of a federal vehicle and the U.S. Marshals were placing me into the Witness Protection Program. I told her the cartel might look for the leak. I begged her to lock the doors and follow the instructions the agents would give them. The line went silent. It was not a silence of sudden panic. It was a strange, heavy stillness. My father picked up the kitchen extension. "Brenda, what is going on?" he asked. "Richard, she is with the government," my mother said. Her tone carried a sharp edge that I misread as terror. I repeated the story to my father. The heavy shipping weights, the laundered cash, the immediate extraction. I waited for him to scream. I waited for him to demand to speak to the agents. I waited for the fierce, protective anger of a father realizing his youngest daughter was in mortal danger. Instead, Richard exhaled. The sound was hollow. It was the sound of a man doing rapid calculations in his head. "Okay, Mia," he said. His voice was unnervingly steady. "Do exactly what they say. Do not contact us. We will handle things on this end." I cried. The tears spilled hot and fast down my cheeks. I told them I loved them. I told them I would survive this and find my way back to them once the trial was over and the cartel was dismantled. I promised I would come home. Agent Davis reached over the seat and tapped his watch. "Time is up." I said goodbye. I handed the phone to the agent. He rolled down the window and dropped the device into the rushing traffic of the highway. I leaned my head against the cold glass of the door and watched the Miami skyline fade into the rain. I thought that terrified phone call was the tragic end of my old life. I thought I was saying a painful farewell to people who loved me. I did not know that phone call was actually the weapon my parents would use to erase me entirely. The federal government relocated me to a second-floor apartment in Omaha, Nebraska. My new existence consisted of beige drywall and a humming refrigerator that kept me awake until dawn. My name was legally changed to Sarah Jenkins. The marshals provided a modest stipend intended to cover basic necessities. I survived on cheap canned soup and tap water. I spent the first 3 months jumping every time a car door slammed in the parking lot. The sound of tires crunching on gravel sent my heart racing. I lived in a constant state of hypervigilance. I assumed the Delgado cartel was hunting the accountant who uncovered their pipeline. The isolation was a physical weight. Back in Miami, I spent my weekends analyzing corporate tax structures. Now, I stared at a popcorn ceiling and counted the passing hours. The silence in that Nebraska apartment was deafening. I missed my family. I worried the cartel might target my parents or my sister to smoke me out. I replayed that frantic 10-minute phone call in my head, assuming my mother and father were terrified for my safety. I pictured Richard boarding up the house. I imagined Brenda pacing the kitchen floor, praying for my safe return. During my 4th month in hiding, Agent Davis brought me a secure, encrypted laptop. The device was heavily monitored. It was strictly intended for reviewing discovery files related to the upcoming money laundering trial. I was expressly forbidden from contacting anyone from my past. But the human desire for connection often overrides logic. Late one evening, while the Nebraska wind rattled my bedroom window, I opened a secure browser. I simply wanted to see if the local Naples News had reported any cartel activity near my parents' neighborhood. I typed my own real name into the search bar. The search results did not show police reports about a missing accountant. They did not show a family living in fear of organized crime. Instead, my screen populated with hundreds of glossy, high-resolution images. I clicked the first link. It directed me to a professionally designed fundraising website. The banner at the top read, "Help Bring Mia Home." Below the bold text was a photograph of me from a Thanksgiving dinner 3 years prior. The narrative underneath the picture caused the blood to freeze in my veins. The text claimed I had vanished in the middle of the night. It stated I was secretly battling severe substance abuse. It spun a wild, fictional tale suggesting I had been lured away by a dangerous radical group operating out of South Florida. The paragraph described my parents as heartbroken victims, desperately trying to save their troubled daughter from her own dark demons. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. My breath grew shallow. I scrolled down the page. There was a donation button. The counter showed they had raised $40,000 from concerned community members. I opened a social media platform. My mother had created a public group dedicated to finding me. It had thousands of followers. I clicked on a video posted just 2 hours earlier. It was a live broadcast of a prayer vigil hosted in the exact same Naples living room where I grew up. The camera angle captured the expensive Persian rug I had purchased for their anniversary. The room was packed with neighbors, church members, and local business owners. My sister Harper stood at the center of the crowd. Harper always knew how to command an audience. She wore a modest black dress, holding a microphone. She spoke in a trembling, fragile voice about how much she missed her troubled little sister. She spun a fabricated story about finding strange pamphlets in my apartment. She claimed she tried to intervene before the addiction took hold. The audience murmured in collective sympathy. Harper wiped a dry eye and stepped back, allowing our mother to take the stage. Brenda approached the microphone. She wore a tailored, modest suit. She held a crumpled tissue in her right hand. My mother performed a masterclass in theatrical grief. She looked directly into the camera lens and delivered a monologue about the sleepless nights she endured wondering if her lost child was shivering in an alleyway. She dabbed her eyes right on cue. She projected the image of a resilient matriarch bearing an unimaginable tragedy. She never mentioned the 10-minute phone call. She never mentioned the U.S. Marshals. She never mentioned the cartel. She knew exactly where I was. She knew I was under federal protection. Yet she stood in our family home selling my reputation for sympathy and cash. Aunt Vivian stepped into the frame. Vivian owned several lucrative dental practices across the state. She represented the upper echelon of Naples society. Vivian possessed the wealth and influence my mother spent her entire life trying to mimic. Vivian wrapped an arm around Brenda. Then my aunt opened her designer purse and withdrew a checkbook. She announced to the gathered crowd that she was funding a private investigator to track down the radical group holding me hostage. She signed a check for $15,000 on camera. She handed the slip of paper to my mother. Brenda accepted the money with a tragic, grateful smile. She pulled Vivian into a tight embrace. I sat alone in the dark Nebraska apartment. The glow of the laptop screen illuminated my face. The cheap metal folding chair creaked as I leaned forward. My family was not hiding in terror. They were thriving. They had taken the most traumatic, terrifying moment of my life and transformed it into a lucrative social empire. My forced exile provided them with the ultimate currency. They gained unquestioning community support, unchecked financial donations, and the spotlight they always craved. They assassinated my character to elevate their own status. I realized then why Richard sounded so calm on the phone that rainy Friday in Miami. He did not sound like a father losing a child. He sounded like a businessman recognizing a golden opportunity. They were monetizing my disappearance. They built a stage on top of my empty grave. A cold, detached clarity washed over me. The girl who cried in the back of that federal SUV died. The forensic accountant took over. I watched the rest of the broadcast, analyzing their body language, calculating the potential tax fraud of their unregistered fundraising accounts. I began taking screenshots. I archived every video. I saved every post. I built a digital vault of their public lies. Brenda cried on camera for her lost daughter, while I watched from 1,000 miles away. I thought the public humiliation was the worst of it. Then the federal auditor called. Year 3 of my federal exile began with a brutal Nebraska winter. The sky remained a bruised gray for months. The snow piled high against the thin glass of my living room window. The harsh weather matched the desolate reality of my existence. I lived under the name Sarah Jenkins. I worked a remote bookkeeping job for a regional plumbing supply company, earning a fraction of my former salary. The work was mundane and repetitive. It required no critical thinking. I merely plugged numbers into generic software and collected a modest paycheck to supplement my federal stipend. I kept my head down. I did not speak to my neighbors. I purchased groceries during the early morning hours when the aisles were empty. The trial of the Delgado Syndicate remained stalled in a perpetual loop of legal motions and delayed hearings. My life was suspended in a frozen holding pattern. The illusion of safety shattered on a Tuesday morning in late January. The radiator in the corner of my bedroom hissed. I was sitting at the small laminate kitchen table drinking instant coffee. A sharp, urgent knock at the front door echoed through the quiet apartment. I froze. The ceramic mug stopped halfway to my mouth. My handlers always called before they arrived. They never showed up unannounced. I set the mug down silently. I walked toward the door, placing my footsteps carefully on the carpet to avoid creaking the floorboards. I leaned forward and peered through the brass peephole. Agent Davis stood in the dim hallway. He wore a heavy wool overcoat. Snow dusted his shoulders. His jaw was clenched tight. He did not possess his usual calm, detached demeanor. His eyes darted up and down the corridor. I unbolted the heavy deadbolt and opened the door. He stepped inside quickly and secured the locks behind him. He carried a thick manila folder tucked under his left arm. "We have a situation," he said. His voice was low and strained. He walked into the kitchen and dropped the folder onto the laminate table. The thick stack of paper landed with a heavy, definitive thud. I stood across from him, feeling the temperature in the room plummet. "The Treasury Department triggered an alarm early this morning," he explained. "A federal auditor flagged a series of unauthorized transactions linked to your original Social Security number." My stomach contracted. The safety net the marshals cast over my past identity was supposed to be impenetrable. I pulled out a wooden chair and sat down. My knees felt weak. I stared at the manila folder. "What kind of transactions?" I asked. Agent Davis opened the flap and extracted a printed ledger. He slid the document across the table. "Your domestic accounts are empty," he stated. I looked at the black ink on the white paper. The numbers blurred for a fraction of a second before my forensic accounting training forced my vision into sharp focus. My checking and savings accounts at a Miami credit union were drained. The balance read 0. $85,000 evaporated. That money represented years of grueling 60-hour work weeks. I sacrificed weekends and holidays to build that safety net. But the financial bleeding did not stop at the bank accounts. Agent Davis pointed to a second document. "The deed to your Brickell condo was transferred 3 days ago," he said. "A cash buyer purchased the property for $410,000. The funds were routed through a private title company and dispersed into an untraceable offshore holding account." The air vanished from my lungs. The ringing in my ears grew deafening. I knew exactly what this meant. The Delgado Syndicate operated a multi-billion-dollar criminal enterprise. They employed sophisticated cybercriminals to wash dirty money across the globe. I assumed the cartel had finally bypassed the federal freeze. They hired a hacker to locate my assets. If they possessed the capability to unmask my banking routing numbers and forge real estate deeds, they possessed the capability to pinpoint my physical location in Omaha. "They found me," I whispered. My hands trembled with such intense force I had to press my palms flat against the kitchen table to steady them. A cold sweat broke across my neck. I looked at Agent Davis, searching for a denial. I wanted him to tell me I was wrong. I wanted him to guarantee my safety. "How long do we have before the hitmen arrive?" I asked. Davis did not offer false comfort. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an encrypted satellite phone. "We do not know," he replied. "I am initiating emergency lockdown protocols right now." For the next 21 days, I lived in a state of suffocating, paralyzing terror. The marshals packed a tactical go bag and placed it by my front door. It contained cash, a new set of forged identification documents, and a burner phone. I stopped sleeping in my bed. I slept on the floor of the hallway, away from any exterior windows. I wore denim jeans and heavy-laced boots to bed. I kept a heavy steel flashlight gripped in my right hand. Every shadow that swept across the living room blinds looked like an assassin holding a suppressed weapon. Every distant siren sounded like a raid. Every creaking floorboard caused my heart to hammer wildly against my ribs. I stopped eating solid food. The anxiety twisted my digestive system into painful knots. I drank tap water and chewed on plain crackers just to survive. Agent Davis stationed a dark sedan across the street from my apartment building. 2 armed federal agents sat inside the vehicle, running rotating 12-hour shifts. The engine idled constantly, blowing white exhaust into the freezing Nebraska air. During those agonizing, sleepless nights, my mind drifted to the stolen property. That high-rise condo represented my independence. I decorated the space myself. I spent weeks choosing the muted gray tiles and the dark oak cabinets. It was my sanctuary away from the suffocating performative demands of my family. And the $85,000 was my armor against the world. Now I possessed nothing. The cartel stripped my identity, and now they stripped my financial history. I felt incredibly vulnerable and exposed. I assumed the syndicate wanted to leave me entirely destitute before they silenced me forever. While I paced the narrow hallway of my apartment, the Federal Cyber Division worked relentlessly around the clock. They subpoenaed server logs from the Miami Credit Union. They tracked the wire transfers across a labyrinth of international banking nodes. They needed to find the exact source of the digital breach to understand how the cartel penetrated the federal firewall. Davis visited my apartment every 48 hours to deliver brief updates. The perpetrators used encrypted virtual private networks to mask their digital footprint. The process required tedious algorithmic decoding. My nerves frayed further with each passing hour. The excruciating weight felt worse than the initial discovery. I just wanted the invisible enemy to show their face. On the morning of the 22nd day, the heavy winter clouds finally broke. Pale sunlight pierced through the slanted plastic blinds of my living room. A sharp knock sounded at the door. 2 quick taps, followed by a pause, then a third tap. It was the federal signal. I unlocked the deadbolt. Agent Davis stepped into the apartment. I braced myself for the worst. I expected him to order me to grab the go bag. I expected a frantic rush down the fire escape into a waiting armored vehicle. But Davis did not look frantic. He looked deeply disturbed, his brow furrowed in a complex expression I could not read. It was a mixture of professional confusion and deep, profound pity. He walked into the kitchen and unzipped his winter coat. He reached into his inner pocket and pulled out a single sheet of paper. He set the document gently on the table. The Cyber Division cracked the encryption, he said softly. They traced the final ping of the wire transfer. I took a deep breath. I expected to hear the name of a notorious hacker syndicate operating out of a concrete bunker in South America. I expected to see a cartel safe house location in Bogota or a digital fortress in Eastern Europe. I picked up the paper. My eyes scanned the black text. I bypassed the technical jargon and looked straight at the geographical coordinates and the physical billing address registered to the IP address. My heart stopped beating for a full second. The air in the room grew instantly stagnant. I looked at the IP address. It wasn't a cartel hacker in Bogota. The computer draining my life savings was registered to a 4-bedroom house in Naples, Florida. I stared at the Naples IP address. The numbers blurred. The geographical coordinates printed beneath those digits belonged to the 2-story colonial home where I grew up. The house where I learned to ride a bicycle. The house where I celebrated my high school graduation. My parents did not hire a hitman. They became thieves. I pushed the piece of paper back across the laminate table. The edge of the page caught on a groove in the wood. My breathing turned shallow. I looked up at Agent Davis. His face remained carefully neutral. Federal agents are trained to deliver devastating news without reacting. How I asked. My voice sounded hollow, a whisper scraping against the quiet walls of the kitchen. How does a suburban housewife and a struggling warehouse manager bypass a United States Treasury freeze? Davis reached into the manila folder. He did not offer apologies. He understood my brain operated on logic and sequence. He pulled out a thick stack of legal filings bound by a heavy brass staple. He placed them in front of me. When we extracted you from Miami, the physical relocation took less than 4 hours, Davis explained. But the financial firewall is not instantaneous. Bureaucracy moves at its own pace. There is a 48-hour administrative intake window before the federal lock fully secures a civilian Social Security number across all domestic banking institutions. I stared at the brass staple. 48 hours. 2 days. That was the tiny window my parents exploited. I opened the legal packet. The first document was a durable power of attorney. It granted Richard and Brenda Mason full, unmitigated control over my financial estate, my real property, and my medical decisions. I looked at the bottom of the page. My signature was forged. It was a decent forgery, but the slant of the letter M was too steep. I checked the date next to the forged signature. It was backdated to the exact Friday I disappeared. "Who notarized this?" I asked. "Look at the stamp," Davis replied. I pressed my thumb against the raised seal. The name read, Marcus Thorne. I knew that name. He was a commercial real estate broker who handled the warehouse leases for my father's pool supply business. Richard utilized his shady business connections to find a corrupt notary willing to turn a blind eye and stamp a fraudulent document for a kickback. But a fake power of attorney was not enough to liquidate a high-rise condo and drain a credit union account without raising red flags. Banks require context for sudden, large-scale asset transfers. I turned the page. The next document was a formal petition filed in the Miami-Dade County Probate Court. My mother and father did not just forge my signature. They filed a sworn affidavit under the penalty of perjury to declare me legally incapacitated. I read my mother's sworn statement. The printed ink felt like poison. Brenda detailed a fabricated history of severe substance abuse. She claimed I suffered a sudden psychotic break. She testified that I abandoned my lucrative career and fled the state to join an extremist group. She presented the judge with the public prayer vigil videos, the glossy missing person flyers, and the community fundraising campaigns as evidence of her desperate maternal concern. They manufactured a public crisis to create a credible paper trail. They used the tears they shed on Facebook to convince a local judge that their youngest daughter was a danger to herself. The judge granted emergency conservatorship to protect my assets from my own fictional drug habits. I flipped to the final page of the court docket. A small printed receipt was attached to the corner. The filing fee for the conservatorship petition was $400. I traced the number with my index finger. $400. For less than the cost of a decent set of tires, my parents legally buried me alive. They stripped me of my autonomy, my property, and my identity. They erased 23 years of my existence for a handful of court fees and a dirty notary stamp. "Arrest them," I said. I looked up at Davis, my jaw clenched tight enough to ache. "Arrest them for wire fraud. Arrest them for perjury. You have the IP address. You have the forged deed. Put them in handcuffs today." Davis let out a slow, measured breath. He rested his hands on the table. "We cannot touch them," he said. I stood up. The wooden chair scraped harshly against the linoleum floor. "What do you mean you cannot touch them? They stole nearly $500,000. They committed federal crimes. They committed localized fraud," Davis corrected. "The jurisdiction belongs to Miami-Dade. If I arrest them right now, the federal government must present the underlying evidence. We would have to unseal the case. We would have to file an indictment in open court." He leaned forward, his gray eyes locked onto mine. "If we file a public indictment, the defense attorneys will demand the victim testify. You would have to file a civil suit under the name Mia Mason. The Delgado cartel employs a small army of defense lawyers who spend every single day monitoring the Florida court dockets for your name. If Mia Mason suddenly appears in a property dispute against Richard Mason, the cartel will find the filing. They will pull the thread. They will track the localized subpoenas right back to this zip code. The bitter, metallic taste of defeat flooded the back of my throat. You are the star witness in a multi-billion-dollar federal racketeering case, Davis continued. The Department of Justice will not risk your life over a stolen condo. We cannot break your cover. Until the cartel trial concludes and the syndicate is dismantled, you must remain a ghost. I looked down at the forged documents. I was trapped inside a perfect legal paradox. I possessed undeniable proof of a devastating crime, but utilizing that proof equated to signing my own death warrant. My parents calculated the risk perfectly. They knew I vanished. They likely assumed I was dead or hiding from people far too dangerous to provoke. They gambled that whoever made me disappear would keep me silenced. They bet their future on my permanent absence. I walked over to the kitchen window and stared out at the snow-covered parking lot. The crushing weight of the betrayal settled deep into my bones. My mother and father did not love me. They loved the resources I provided. When I was no longer physically present to provide those resources, they simply extracted them from my ghost. A normal person might have shattered under the weight of that realization. A normal daughter might have collapsed onto the floor and wept for the parents she lost. But I shed my last tears in the back of a federal SUV 3 years ago. I turned away from the window, I walked back to the table, and picked up the fixed stack of legal filings. I tapped the edges against the laminate surface, aligning the papers into a neat, orderly stack. I handed the folder back to Agent Davis. "I need a favor," I said. My voice was no longer a hollow whisper. It carried the crisp, precise tone of a senior auditor. Davis raised an eyebrow. "Name it." "I need you to pull every tax return Richard Mason files for the next 2 years. I need the routing numbers for the offshore holding account they used to wash the real estate funds. And I need a secure database to store my work." Davis watched me carefully. "You cannot take action, Mia. The U.S. Attorney will not authorize it." "I am not asking for authorization to take action today," I replied. "I am asking for the raw data." He nodded slowly. He understood. He gathered the manila folder and tucked it back under his overcoat. He turned toward the door. "I will send the encrypted files to your secure laptop by midnight," he said. The heavy deadbolt slid into place as he exited the apartment. I stood alone in the quiet kitchen. The hissing radiator provided the only sound in the empty room. I couldn't be a daughter anymore, so I became what I am best at. I became an accountant. I sat in silence for 2 years, building a spreadsheet that would destroy them. I created the master spreadsheet on a Tuesday night. The Nebraska wind howled against the thin exterior walls of my apartment, rattling the window panes in their cheap aluminum frames. I sat at the small kitchen table, illuminated only by the harsh blue glow of the encrypted laptop monitor. My hands hovered over the keyboard. I was no longer a terrified woman hiding from a cartel. I was an architect drafting a blueprint for ruin. The header of the document contained a single figure: $495,000. That was the exact combined total of my drained savings account and the fraudulent cash sale of my Brickell condo. It represented my entire adult life converted into raw digital currency. I needed to track the dispersion of those funds. Agent Davis provided the routing numbers for the offshore holding account my parents used to wash the real estate proceeds. I spent 72 hours breaking down the ledger, matching dates, and tracing outgoing wire transfers back into the domestic banking system. I labeled the first major expenditure column with a single name: Harper. My sister was 25 years old and possessed a talent for existing as the center of gravity in any room she entered. Growing up, Harper never held a summer job. She never balanced a checkbook. She majored in public relations at a private university our parents could barely afford, dropping out after 3 semesters because the schedule felt too demanding. She operated under the firm belief that the universe owed her a beautiful, comfortable existence. Our mother and father spent 2 decades reinforcing that delusion. At 25, Harper found a partner who matched her superficial ambitions. His name was Preston. He worked as a junior executive at a boutique commercial real estate title firm in downtown Miami. Preston drove a leased sports car and wore expensive tailored suits he purchased on credit. He possessed slick ambition and a desperate hunger to climb the South Florida social ladder. He viewed my family as respectable suburbanites. Harper viewed him as a ticket to a luxury lifestyle. 3 months after the dirty notary stamped the backdated power of attorney, the offshore holding account registered its first major hemorrhage. A wire transfer for exactly $60,000 exited the Cayman routing matrix and landed in a regional Florida bank under my father's name. 24 hours later, that exact sum was issued as a cashier's check to a high-end auto dealership in Coral Gables. I opened a blank browser tab and logged into a dummy social media account I created for surveillance. I navigated to Harper's public Instagram profile. I did not have to scroll far. There was a photograph uploaded the very same afternoon the cashier's check cleared. The image showed Harper standing in a sunlit dealership parking lot. She wore designer sunglasses and a pristine white sundress. She was leaning against the hood of a brand new luxury Audi SUV. The vehicle featured a custom red leather interior and upgraded sport rims. Harper held the keys up toward the camera lens, her diamond engagement ring catching the harsh Florida sunlight. The caption beneath the photograph read, "Best parents in the world. Thank you, Mom and Dad, for the ultimate early wedding gift. Feeling so blessed." I stared at the screen. The silence of the Omaha apartment pressed against my eardrums. My sister was gripping a steering wheel purchased with my liquidated identity. My parents stole the safety net I built through agonizing 80-hour work weeks and handed it to their favorite child as a prop for her social media feed. I typed the transaction data into the spreadsheet. Date, amount, destination. I linked the screenshot of the Audi. But $60,000 was merely a down payment on their grand illusion. The true financial bleeding began 5 months later when the wedding planning commenced. I tracked a second outgoing wire. This transaction eclipsed the first. $120,000 moved from the offshore account back into my father's local bank. From there, the funds were dispersed in a flurry of large, rapid payments. I followed the digital breadcrumbs. They led straight to the corporate accounts of the Ritz-Carlton in Naples. I navigated back to the surveillance browser. I found the public wedding website Harper and Preston designed. The landing page featured a sweeping drone shot of the luxury resort overlooking the Gulf of Mexico. The itinerary boasted a weekend of lavish extravagance: a welcome reception on a private yacht, a 10-piece brass band for the reception, imported orchids cascading from the ceiling, a custom-carved ice sculpture for the cocktail hour. I sat back in my wooden chair and let the absurdity of the situation wash over me. I knew the exact financial anatomy of Richard's pool supply business. I audited his ledgers in my head. He operated on razor-thin margins. He routinely delayed vendor payments just to make payroll. He drove a 10-year-old pickup truck with a failing transmission. His warehouse roof leaked every hurricane season because he could not afford a commercial repair crew. Yet he was suddenly underwriting a 6-figure luxury wedding at a premier oceanfront resort. Harper knew this. She grew up listening to him complain about the price of chlorine and freight shipping. She watched him struggle to keep the warehouse lights on. Ignorance is not a natural state. It is a cultivated habit. Harper saw the sudden influx of cash. She saw the new car and the Ritz-Carlton deposits. A rational adult would ask questions. A rational adult would wonder how a failing warehouse manager suddenly acquired the liquid assets of a lottery winner. But asking questions meant risking the answers. If Harper inquired about the origin of the money, she might have to return the Audi. She might have to cancel the imported orchids. She might have to scale back the brass band. It was far easier to believe a convenient lie that bought her a designer wedding dress than to confront an ugly truth. She chose the veil of willful blindness. She eagerly subsidized her dream life with the blood money of her absent, troubled sister. She accepted the narrative my parents sold because the narrative funded her luxury. My fingers flew across the keyboard, documenting every vendor deposit, every floral arrangement, every catering invoice. I tied every single expenditure directly back to the offshore account containing the proceeds of my stolen condo. As I logged the title of the real estate company where Preston worked, a cold, hard realization struck the base of my skull. I paused typing. I opened a new search tab. I pulled up the public property records for Miami-Dade County. I navigated to the deed transfer history for my Brickell condo. I bypassed the fraudulent power of attorney and looked at the processing agency that facilitated the cash sale. The digital signature on the escrow clearance belonged to a boutique commercial real estate title firm in downtown Miami. It was the exact same firm where Preston worked as a junior executive. The gears of the conspiracy clicked into place with devastating precision. Richard and Brenda did not navigate the complex web of real estate liquidation alone. They needed an insider. They needed someone who understood escrow accounts, title transfers, and offshore routing. Preston did not just marry into the stolen money, he helped facilitate the theft. He used his corporate credentials to push the fraudulent sale through the system without raising red flags. I added a new column to the spreadsheet. I typed Preston's name at the top. I looked at the meticulous rows of data glowing on the monitor. I possessed the entire anatomy of their crime. I mapped the flow of every stolen dollar. The trap was fully constructed, awaiting the correct moment to spring. Harper was wearing my stolen life, but she was about to learn a very hard lesson. Federal math does not forgive, and neither do I. The stolen condo and the drained bank accounts represented a profound breach of trust. I believed that financial theft was the absolute bottom of the moral abyss my parents had dug. I thought their greed was the driving force behind my erasure. I was wrong. The financial theft was merely a convenient byproduct of a much darker betrayal. During my 4th year in Omaha, the perpetual delay of the Delgado Syndicate trial finally ended. The federal prosecutors secured key indictments. The Department of Justice began preparing for open court proceedings. Agent Davis visited my apartment more frequently, delivering heavy encrypted hard drives containing thousands of pages of discovery documents. My task was to review the raw financial data I had flagged years ago and prepare my testimony explaining the money laundering mechanisms to a civilian jury. The Nebraska summer outside my window was sweltering, but the air inside my apartment felt perpetually cold. I sat at my kitchen table for 12 hours a day, scrolling through endless digital ledgers. I reviewed shipping manifests, Port Authority customs declarations, and international wire routing codes. I analyzed the specific logistics firm the Delgado cartel used to wash their illicit profits. This was the same logistics firm my father had recommended to my accounting agency years ago, praising their honest executives. Late one Thursday afternoon, I was cross-referencing a secondary vendor list. The prosecutors wanted to identify the domestic businesses that knowingly accepted inflated invoices to help the cartel move cash across state lines. I scrolled past dozens of generic LLC names: construction companies, scrap metal yards, regional freight haulers. My eyes snagged on a corporate registration code. I stopped scrolling. I highlighted the entry. The vendor was listed as Aquatech Distribution Holdings, LLC. The name meant nothing on the surface. It was a generic corporate identifier designed to blend into a crowded spreadsheet. But as a forensic accountant, my brain automatically processed tax identification numbers before reading the corporate names attached to them. I recognized the sequence of the tax identification number. I had memorized that specific sequence years ago when I helped my father prepare his annual corporate tax returns. I pulled up a secondary database and ran the tax code. The ownership records populated instantly. Aquatech Distribution Holdings, LLC was a registered subsidiary of Mason Pool Supply. My father's failing warehouse was on the cartel's domestic vendor list. A sharp, cold pressure seized my chest. I felt the physical sensation of the air thinning in the room. I leaned closer to the monitor. I opened the specific invoice records tied to Aquatech Distribution. The documents detailed years of transactions between my father's business and the cartel-controlled logistics firm. The records showed Mason Pool Supply consistently ordering massive bulk shipments of industrial chlorine and algicide. I looked at the freight weight logs. The memory of my initial audit in Miami slammed into my consciousness. I remembered sitting at my desk 3 years ago, puzzled by the physics of those pallets. The highway weigh station tickets registered the shipments at nearly double the expected cargo weight for standard pool chemicals. At the time, I dismissed it as a clerical error. I was looking at the answer to that discrepancy. The pallets were not heavy because of a clerical error. They were heavy because the Delgado Syndicate was packing vacuum-sealed bricks of illicit street cash inside the commercial chemical drums. Richard was receiving the shipments, unpacking the cash, and running the dirty money through his own corporate banking structure, disguised as inflated inventory sales. He was returning the clean money to the logistics firm, keeping a 5% processing fee for his trouble. My father was an active participating node in a multi-billion-dollar federal racketeering enterprise. I pushed my chair back from the table. The plastic legs squealed against the linoleum. I stood up and paced the narrow length of the kitchen. The implications of this discovery cascaded through my mind, reshaping everything I thought I knew about the timeline of my exile. I rewound the events of that fateful Friday afternoon in Miami. When I uncovered the $4 million anomaly and flagged the logistics firm, my managing partner immediately contacted the FBI. The federal agents arrived at my office within hours. But federal investigations of that magnitude do not begin the moment an accountant makes a phone call. The FBI had likely been monitoring the Delgado Syndicate for months. My audit simply provided the definitive, hard evidence they needed to secure warrants. The cartel possessed deep, extensive surveillance networks. They employed dirty cops and corrupt court clerks. The moment the FBI initiated the extraction protocols, the syndicate would have known a breach occurred. They would have scrambled to identify the leak. I thought about the 10-minute phone call I made from the back of the armored SUV. I remembered the sound of my father's voice on the kitchen extension. I expected panic. I expected outrage. I expected the fierce protective terror of a parent realizing his child was in the crosshairs of a violent criminal organization. Instead, Richard sounded hollow. He sounded like a man doing rapid calculations. He told me to do exactly what the agents said. He told me not to contact them. He did not sound shocked because the information I provided was not a surprise. Richard knew the logistics firm was a cartel front because he was working for them. When I told him I audited that specific firm and uncovered the money laundering pipeline, he instantly understood the gravity of the situation. He realized his youngest daughter had just handed the federal government the keys to dismantle the exact criminal enterprise paying his mortgage. More importantly, he knew the cartel would hunt me down to silence me. And he knew that if the syndicate captured me, they would torture me for information. If I broke under interrogation, I would point the FBI directly toward the domestic vendors, including Mason Pool Supply. My father did not agree to let me vanish into WITSEC to keep me safe. He let me vanish to protect himself. He knew the Delgado hitmen were mobilizing. He knew I was the primary target. He possessed the inside knowledge to warn me, to pull me out of the accounting firm before the audit was finalized. He could have confessed. He could have taken the fall and shielded his daughter from the fallout of his own illegal side hustle. Instead, he remained silent. He allowed me to stumble blindly into the crosshairs of a ruthless syndicate. He let the federal government erase my existence because my permanent disappearance was the only guarantee his own crimes would remain buried. And once I was safely locked away in a federal ghost town, unable to defend myself or communicate with the outside world, he capitalized on my absence. He used his corrupt real estate connections to forge a power of attorney. He liquidated my high-rise condo and drained my savings accounts, using the stolen funds to subsidize Harper's luxury lifestyle and maintain his own facade of suburban respectability. I walked back to the kitchen table. I looked at the glowing screen. The spreadsheet mapping the stolen funds was open in one tab. The cartel vendor list was open in another. The puzzle was finally complete. Every jagged piece fit together with sickening precision. My parents didn't just rob me when I disappeared. They were the very reason I had a target on my back in the first place. I did not cry when the final piece of the puzzle snapped into place. Tears are an emotional luxury reserved for people who lack hard evidence. I possessed the evidence. I sat in that freezing Omaha apartment and stared at the glowing monitor, feeling an unnatural, terrifying calm wash over my nervous system. The biological connection between a daughter and her parents severed right there in the dark. Richard and Brenda Mason ceased to be my family. They became subjects in a forensic audit. They became hostile entities in a criminal conspiracy. I spent the next 2 years transforming my beige dining area into a war room. I pushed the small laminate table against the far wall and requested a large corkboard from Agent Davis. I pinned printed bank statements, shipping logs, and property deeds to the cork. I connected the geographical IP locations to the fraudulent wire transfers using strands of red yarn. I treated my own life like a multi-million-dollar corporate embezzlement case. Every single morning before logging into my remote bookkeeping job, I dedicated 3 hours to building the trap. I cataloged the exact chronological sequence of my erasure. I documented the backdated power of attorney. I verified the dirty notary stamp belonging to Marcus Thorne. I cross-referenced the local Miami-Dade probate court filings with the offshore Cayman routing numbers. Agent Davis became my silent partner in this localized investigation. Federal agents appreciate civilians who do their heavy lifting. I handed him airtight, meticulous dossiers. Together, we worked to fuse Richard's localized fraud with the sweeping federal cartel case. We established the undeniable link between my father's money laundering for the Delgado Syndicate and the sudden influx of cash required to fund his suburban facade. We proved that the moment the logistics firm faced federal scrutiny, Richard needed a new source of untraceable capital. My disappearance provided that capital. He sacrificed his daughter to the federal government and then scavenged her abandoned assets to keep his own sinking ship afloat. But a conspiracy of that magnitude required specialized assistance. Richard ran a pool supply warehouse. He did not possess the technical literacy to bypass international banking firewalls or override complex commercial escrow accounts. I turned my focus toward Preston. Harper's fiancé worked as a junior executive at a boutique commercial real estate title firm in downtown Miami. He was a man driven by appearances, relying on tailored suits and leased sports cars to project an aura of wealth he did not actually possess. My sister viewed him as a ticket to high society. I viewed him as the weak link in the chain. Commercial real estate sales require highly secure digital authorizations. Title companies utilize encrypted employee identification tokens to approve the final transfer of high-value deeds. I asked Agent Davis to subpoena the back-end server logs for the specific title company that processed the cash sale of my Brickell condo. It took the Federal Cyber Division 3 weeks to untangle the proprietary software, but they finally delivered the raw data. I scanned the dense lines of hexadecimal code looking for the digital footprint left on the escrow clearance. There it was, a unique employee identification number stamped on the exact millisecond the fraudulent deed transferred to the cash buyer. We ran the identification number through the corporate registry. It belonged directly to Preston. He was not merely a passive beneficiary enjoying the spoils of a wealthy future father-in-law. Preston actively facilitated the theft. He used his secure corporate credentials to manually override the red flags on the backdated power of attorney. He pushed the fraudulent sale through the Florida real estate matrix, ensuring the cash vanished into the offshore holding account before the federal freeze could stop it. I printed the server log. I took a red marker and drew a thick circle around Preston's name. I pinned the paper to the corkboard, right next to a photograph of Harper standing in front of her newly purchased Audi. The scope of the crime elevated dramatically. This was no longer a simple case of familial identity theft. By utilizing interstate wire transfers, offshore banking channels, and corrupt corporate officers, my parents and their future son-in-law crossed a dangerous threshold. They engaged in a coordinated, continuous pattern of racketeering activity. I was not just building a civil lawsuit to reclaim a stolen condo. I was building a federal RICO case. The Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act is the ultimate hammer in the federal arsenal. It allows law enforcement to seize every single asset tied to the conspirators. It strips criminals of their homes, their vehicles, and their bank accounts before a trial even begins. I gathered every forged signature, every IP log, every digital token override, and every offshore routing code. I organized the documents into separate, highly indexed folders. I placed the folders inside a heavy black leather tote bag. The bag sat by my front door, a silent, patient weapon, waiting to be deployed. But I could not move until the primary threat was eliminated. The cartel trial dominated my 5th year in exile. The Department of Justice flew me to a secure, undisclosed federal courthouse in Texas. I spent 3 grueling days on the witness stand. I sat behind a protective screen detailing the complex structuring of the Delgado Syndicate's financial pipeline. I explained the heavy chemical pallets. I traced the phantom routing numbers for the jury. I felt the burning stares of the cartel lieutenants sitting at the defense tables. I did not flinch. Surviving the profound betrayal of my own flesh and blood fortified my spine. Facing organized crime lords felt like a secondary concern compared to facing the mother who sold my reputation for community sympathy. The trial concluded after 6 exhaustive weeks. The jury deliberated for a mere 4 days. The verdicts echoed through the courtroom like thunder. Guilty on all counts of racketeering. Guilty on all counts of money laundering. Guilty on all counts of conspiracy. The Delgado Syndicate was effectively dismantled. The primary leadership faced consecutive life sentences in maximum security penitentiaries. The remaining operations fractured, dissolving under the immense pressure of global asset seizures. Agent Davis met me in the secure debriefing room shortly after the final gavel fell. He carried a single sheet of paper bearing the seal of the United States Marshals Service. He slid the document across the metal table. "The threat matrix is clear," he said. "The protective order is officially lifted. You no longer need to hide." I looked at the signature on the release form. For 5 years, I responded to the name Sarah Jenkins. For 5 years, I lived as a ghost in a freezing Midwestern city. I surrendered my youth, my career, and my sense of safety to ensure justice was served. I signed the acknowledgement line using my true legal name, Mia Mason. The ink felt right. The letters felt sharp and familiar. I returned to Omaha for the final time. I terminated the lease on the beige apartment. I packed a single suitcase. I drove to a high-end boutique and purchased a crisp white linen dress. I wanted a garment that projected unfiltered, undeniable clarity. I wanted to wear something that stood in stark defiance of the dirty, runaway drug addict narrative my parents peddled to the world. I purchased a one-way, first-class airline ticket to Southwest Florida International Airport. The annual Mason family summer reunion was scheduled for the second Sunday in July. Richard and Brenda hosted the event every single year, renting a large open-air pavilion at a sprawling public park in Naples. They always used the gathering as a stage to perform their grief, accepting quiet condolences from unsuspecting aunts, uncles, and cousins. The trial was over. I was a free woman. I packed my leather tote bag, booked a flight to Naples, and prepared to crash a barbecue. The memory of the freezing Omaha apartment dissolved. I was standing on the damp grass of the Naples Park Pavilion. The transition from 5 years of isolated silence to this crowded, suffocating space felt like stepping through a physical barrier. The heavy Florida humidity wrapped around me, pressing against my skin. The scent of roasting meat and charcoal lighter fluid hung thick under the corrugated aluminum roof. A cheerful country song had been playing from a portable speaker resting on the buffet table. Someone reached over and pulled the power cord. The sudden absence of music amplified the tension. 40 relatives stood frozen in various states of shock. Aunts, uncles, and cousins stared at me with wide, unblinking eyes. They expected to see the hollow, sunken face of a troubled runaway. They spent 5 years conditioned to believe I was battling severe chemical dependencies while trapped in a radical cult. Instead, they saw a 28-year-old woman standing tall in a pristine white linen dress. My hair was neatly styled. My posture was straight. I carried a heavy, structured black leather tote bag over my right shoulder. I did not look like a victim. I looked like an auditor arriving to inspect a bankrupt corporation. The cognitive dissonance rippled through the crowd, causing a wave of confused murmurs. My mother, Brenda, possesses a predatory survival instinct. It took her brain exactly 4 seconds to process my arrival. She stared at me, recognizing the white dress and the steady calm in my eyes. She understood immediately that the ghost she buried had returned to haunt her. But Brenda is a creature of performance. She spent decades manipulating the social dynamics of our extended family, and she refused to surrender her stage without a fight. Her initial shock smoothed out into calculated theatrical action. The panic vanished behind a mask of overwhelming maternal relief. Tears materialized in her eyes with startling speed. She dropped her plastic cup of wine onto the grass. She sprinted toward me, her arms opened wide, reaching out to embrace the daughter she legally erased. "Mia," she cried out. Her voice was pitched high, trembling with manufactured emotion. "Oh my God, you are alive! You came back to us!" It was a brilliant tactical maneuver. To the untrained observer, her sprint looked like pure, desperate love. But I spent the last 2 years dissecting her psychology. I knew exactly what she was trying to do. She wanted to establish physical dominance. She wanted to wrap her arms around my neck and press my face into her shoulder, smothering any words I might try to speak. She needed to contain the threat while simultaneously selling her grieving mother narrative to the gaping relatives. It was crowd control disguised as affection. She closed the distance between us, her expensive perfume wafting through the humid air. She reached for my shoulders. I did not flinch. I kept my eyes locked on hers and took one single deliberate step backward. Her arms closed around empty air. The momentum of her sprint carried her forward, causing her to stumble slightly on the damp concrete pad. She caught her balance and looked up at me. The mask slipped for a fraction of a second, revealing a flash of pure, unadulterated venom. She hated me for denying her the performance. "Do not touch me, Brenda," I said. My voice was not loud, but the acoustic design of the pavilion carried the words perfectly over the breeze. I did not call her mom. I stripped her of the maternal title she used to shield her crimes. A collective gasp echoed from the picnic tables. Aunt Vivian, who was still staring at the shattered remains of her deviled egg platter, covered her mouth with her hand. The disrespect of calling a grieving mother by her first name shocked the audience. They still believed the lie. They still thought I was the villain, breaking a fragile woman's heart. Brenda retreated a half step, clutching her hands to her chest as if she had been physically struck. She looked back at the crowd, ensuring everyone witnessed my cold rejection. My father, Richard, read the room. He realized Brenda's frontal assault had failed. The theatrical approach did not neutralize the threat. He decided to switch tactics. He needed to invalidate my presence before I opened my mouth. He stepped forward, abandoning his dropped beer bottle. He adopted a deep, soothing tone. It was the voice of a weary, concerned patriarch trying to manage an unpredictable crisis. "Mia, honey," he said, stepping into my line of sight, "you are sick. You are clearly unwell. We are just so glad you are safe. Let us take you to the car. We can get you the help you need right now." Richard reached his large, calloused hand toward my elbow. He wanted to physically isolate me. He understood that staying in front of 40 witnesses was dangerous. If he could guide me to the parking lot and shove me into the passenger seat of his truck, he could control the fallout. He was trying to enforce the old family dynamic where the men managed the problems and the problematic women were quietly hidden away. He took another step, closing in on my left side. He prepared to grip my arm and steer me away from the pavilion. The tall man in the gray suit standing 2 steps behind my right shoulder finally moved. Agent Davis stepped smoothly between my father and me. He did not rush. He moved with the fluid, practiced confidence of a man who carried the full weight of the federal government behind him. He planted his leather shoes firmly on the concrete, acting as an impenetrable physical barrier between my father's outstretched hand and my body. Richard stopped short, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Excuse me," Richard said, trying to look around the tall man. "This is a private family matter. I need to take my daughter to a hospital." Agent Davis reached into the inner breast pocket of his suit jacket. He withdrew a flat leather wallet. With a flick of his wrist, he opened the wallet and held it up at eye level. The heavy gold shield caught the afternoon sunlight. The bold blue lettering of the Federal Bureau of Investigation gleamed. "Nobody is going anywhere," Agent Davis said. His voice was a low, resonant baritone. It carried no emotion and required no volume to command immediate obedience. It was the voice of a system that did not care about suburban reputations or family politics. Richard stared at the badge. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, pale gray. His hand dropped to his side. The concerned patriarch routine evaporated. He recognized the shield. He recognized the implications. The cartel trial was over, but the fallout had just arrived at his barbecue. The silence under the pavilion turned heavy and oppressive. The relatives stopped murmuring. Harper, who was standing by the buffet table next to Preston, froze with a paper plate in her hand. The entire Mason family social structure held its collective breath. Brenda looked at the federal agent and then looked back at me. Her chest heaved. The fake tears dried up, replaced by genuine rising panic. I adjusted the strap of the black leather tote bag resting on my shoulder. I looked directly into my mother's eyes. I wanted her to see the crisp white linen dress blowing gently in the wind. I wanted her to look at the daughter she tried to bury and realize the dirt had been brushed off. "I was never sick," I said. My words cut through the humid air with surgical precision. I was testifying. "And you knew." The accusation hung in the thick air under the aluminum roof. The 40 relatives standing around the picnic tables processed the statement with visible confusion. The narrative they had consumed for 5 years involved drug addiction, a dangerous cult, and a desperate search. The words testifying and federal agent did not fit into that established framework. They looked back and forth between my mother's pale, panicked face and the gold badge Agent Davis held in his hand. Aunt Vivian stepped forward. She carefully navigated around the shattered pieces of porcelain and the ruined deviled eggs scattered on the concrete. Vivian built her dental empire by demanding clarity and holding people accountable. She did not tolerate ambiguity. She stopped 3 feet away from my mother. Her eyes narrowed behind her expensive designer glasses. "Brenda, what is she talking about?" Vivian asked. Her tone was sharp, demanding an immediate explanation. "What does she mean, you knew?" My mother's throat worked frantically as she swallowed. She looked at Vivian and then darted her gaze toward the crowd of relatives. She needed to retain control of the audience. She needed to pivot the narrative before the foundation completely crumbled. "She is delusional," Vivian Brenda stammered, her voice pitched high, attempting to sound fragile. "She has been gone for 5 years. Her mind is clearly broken. She doesn't know what she is saying. We need to get her to a psychiatric facility right now." It was a desperate final attempt to utilize the crazy woman defense. If she could convince the family that my statements were the ramblings of a damaged mind, she could survive the afternoon. I did not raise my voice. I did not engage in a screaming match. Shouting matches are designed to elicit emotional reactions, and I had no interest in their feelings. I am an accountant. I do not argue with emotions. I argue with paper. I reached up and unclasped the heavy brass buckle on my black leather tote bag. The sound of the metal clasp snapping open drew the attention of every person under the pavilion. I reached inside the dark interior of the bag. My fingers closed around the thick manila folders I had meticulously assembled over the last 2 years in that freezing Omaha apartment. I pulled out the first stack of documents. The edges of the pages were lined with brightly colored index tabs. I walked over to the nearest wooden picnic table. I held the stack 2 feet above the surface and let go. The heavy thud of paper impacting solid wood echoed loudly across the concrete pad. "Exhibit A," I announced. My voice was crisp and clinical. I pointed to the top document. The United States Marshals Service seal was clearly visible. It was a copy of the emergency intake authorization forms. "This is the Federal Protective Order signed on the Friday evening I disappeared 5 years ago." I continued addressing the crowd while keeping my eyes fixed on my mother. "Look at the second page. Look at the section designated for emergency contacts and notified parties." I stepped back, allowing Vivian to lean over the table and read the text. "Richard and Brenda Mason are listed as notified parties," I stated. "They received a briefing from the federal government within 48 hours of my extraction. They knew I entered the Witness Protection Program. They knew I was scheduled to testify in a federal cartel trial. They knew I was safe." A collective murmur rippled through the crowd. The confusion morphed into profound, uneasy shock. I turned my attention to the aunts, uncles, and cousins who had gathered for the reunion. Many of them had attended the prayer vigils. Many of them had written checks to support the search efforts. "They did not spend your search fund donations looking for me," I said, projecting my voice to reach the back rows. "They knew exactly where I was. They spent your money on country club membership renewals and luxury vacations. They used your sympathy to subsidize their lifestyle." Brenda let out a short, gasping breath. "That is a lie," she screeched, pointing a manicured finger at me. "She forged those papers. She is trying to destroy this family." I reached back into the leather tote bag. I pulled out the second folder. This stack was twice as thick as the first. It contained the financial anatomy of their crimes. I walked back to the picnic table and dropped the second stack right next to the protective order. "Exhibit B," I said. I flipped open the cover. The backdated durable power of attorney sat on top. While I was locked in a safe house thousands of miles away, unable to contact the outside world, my parents hired a corrupt real estate broker named Marcus Thorne to notarize a fraudulent document, I explained. I tapped the forged signature with my index finger. The slant on the letter M is incorrect. My mother forged my name to grant herself total control over my assets. I pulled out the Miami-Dade County Probate Court petition and laid it beside the forgery. They then filed a sworn affidavit under the penalty of perjury, claiming I had suffered a psychotic break. I continued. They used the videos of their fake prayer vigils as evidence to convince a judge to grant them emergency conservatorship. They paid a $400 filing fee to legally bury me alive. The relatives pressed closer to the table, their eyes wide as they stared at the official court stamps. I reached into the folder and produced the bank statements and the property deeds. I spread them out across the wooden planks, creating a mosaic of undeniable financial ruin. Once they secured the conservatorship, they drained my credit union savings account, I stated. $85,000 vanished in a single afternoon. 3 days later, they executed a cash sale of my Brickell condo for $410,000. They routed the proceeds through an offshore holding account to bypass federal banking flags. The silence under the pavilion was absolute. The magnitude of the theft paralyzed the audience. They were not just looking at a family dispute. They were looking at $500,000 of documented fraud perpetrated by the smiling couple who hosted their summer barbecues. Harper had remained frozen by the buffet tables throughout the entire exchange. She still held a flimsy paper plate loaded with potato salad. The glossy, confident exterior she meticulously maintained for her social media feeds began to crack. She set the plate down on the edge of the serving station and slowly walked toward the picnic table. She stood beside Aunt Vivian. She looked down at the highlighted bank statements and the property deed transfer logs. She recognized the address of my Brickell condo, printed on the official county paperwork. Harper's eyes tracked the dates. She saw the chronological progression. the forged signature, the court filing, the drained accounts, the cash real estate sale. She saw the offshore routing numbers. She looked up. Her perfectly styled blonde hair shifted slightly in the breeze. She turned her gaze toward Brenda, who was standing rigidly next to Richard, her hands gripping the hem of her expensive blouse. Mom Harper asked. Her voice cracked, losing its usual commanding resonance. It sounded small and uncertain. "Did you sell Mia's house?" The 30 years of family lies were about to expire. Harper stood motionless by the picnic table. The synthetic reality she inhabited for the past 5 years began to fracture under the weight of the physical evidence. The pristine image of our wealthy, generous parents dissolved, leaving behind the undeniable truth of a calculated financial extraction. She lunged forward. Her manicured fingers gripped the edges of the highlighted bank statements. The heavy paper crumpled slightly under her tight grasp. Her eyes darted across the printed rows of offshore routing numbers and corresponding domestic deposits. I watched her trace the specific sequence of dates. She found the first major dispersion. A withdrawal for $60,000 exited the Cayman holding account and landed in Richard's local business ledger. She looked at the date printed next to the transaction. It was a Tuesday in late April. I knew she remembered that exact Tuesday. It was the afternoon she drove to the Coral Gables auto dealership. It was the afternoon Richard handed her a freshly minted cashier's check to cover the down payment on her luxury Audi SUV. She stared at the black ink. The numbers formed a mirror, reflecting her own vanity. She traded her missing sister for leather seats and upgraded sport rims. Her finger moved further down the page. She found the second catastrophic cluster of withdrawals. $120,000 diverted into the corporate accounts of the Ritz-Carlton. The dates aligned perfectly with the timeline of her wedding planning. The imported orchids, the private yacht reception, the 10-piece brass band. Every single luxury she flaunted on her social media feeds originated from the fraudulent liquidation of My Brickell high-rise. Harper's breathing turned shallow and erratic. The color drained from her cheeks. She dropped the bank statements onto the wooden planks. She looked at our mother. Mom Harper whispered. Her voice carried the raw, ragged tone of a child waking up from a nightmare. "Tell me you did not pay for my wedding with Mia's house. Tell me you did not buy my car with her savings." Brenda opened her mouth to speak, but no sound emerged. The grand matriarch possessed no script for this particular scene. Her theatrical grief proved useless against hard forensic accounting. She looked away, unable to meet the gaze of her favorite daughter. Preston stepped up behind Harper. My sister's fiancé always cultivated an aura of untouchable corporate success. He wore a custom-tailored navy suit to a humid park barbecue. He checked his expensive wristwatch frequently, signaling that his time held immense value. He operated in a world of aggressive social climbing, where reputation served as the ultimate currency. Preston leaned over Harper's shoulder and read the court documents. His eyes skipped past the emotional betrayal and focused entirely on the legal ramifications. He saw the federal protective order. He saw the forged durable power of attorney. He saw the offshore Cayman routing matrix. His brain processed the data with cold, mechanical efficiency. He recognized the presence of Agent Davis. He understood that the Federal Bureau of Investigation does not attend family reunions to settle minor domestic disputes. They arrive to dismantle criminal syndicates and enforce federal indictments. Preston realized the ship was rapidly taking on water. He decided to secure his own lifeboat. He took a deliberate step backward, physically distancing himself from Harper. He adjusted his silk tie, ensuring his appearance remained unruffled. "I cannot be associated with this," Preston said. His voice was smooth, detached, and entirely devoid of empathy. Harper spun around to face him. The shock on her face deepened. "Preston," she pleaded, reaching a trembling hand toward his jacket sleeve. "What are you talking about? We have to figure this out." Preston sidestepped her grasp. He brushed imaginary dust from his lapel. "There is nothing to figure out, Harper," he replied. "You are looking at documented federal wire fraud. My commercial real estate firm handles government contracting. We undergo strict, routine background checks. If the Compliance Board discovers I am marrying into a family under active federal investigation for asset theft, my career is over. I will lose my broker license. I will lose my partnerships." He looked at Richard and Brenda with undisguised disgust. Then he looked back at the woman he promised to marry in less than 2 months. "The wedding is off," he stated. His tone carried the finality of a closing business transaction. "I suggest you retain a very good defense attorney." He turned his back on my sister. He acted the part of the innocent bystander caught in the crossfire of a dysfunctional family. He planned to walk to his leased sports car, drive back to Miami, and scrub every trace of the Mason family from his digital footprint. I watched him take 2 confident strides toward the parking lot. A quiet, profound satisfaction settled into my chest. I allowed him the brief, fleeting illusion of escape before I brought the hammer down. "Not so fast, Preston," I said. My voice stopped him mid-stride. He turned his head, looking at me with a mixture of irritation and forced politeness. "I have no involvement in your family drama, Mia," he said. He offered a tight, synthetic smile. "I am sorry for what your parents did to you, but I am removing myself from the equation." I did not return the smile. I reached into the dark interior of my black leather tote bag for the final time. I bypassed the standard manila folders and extracted a slim, bright blue folder. "You do not get to remove yourself from an equation you helped write," I replied. I turned toward Agent Davis and handed him the blue folder. The federal agent accepted the file, opening the cover to reveal the dense pages of hexadecimal code and server logs inside. I addressed the crowd, ensuring every relative under the pavilion heard the precise mechanics of the theft. "My parents forged a signature to grant themselves control of my estate," I explained. "But liquidating a premium high-rise condo requires navigating strict commercial escrow protocols. Real estate title transfers undergo rigorous fraud detection measures. A simple forged document is often flagged by compliance officers before the funds clear." I looked directly at Preston. The synthetic smile melted off his face. "Richard and Brenda needed an insider," I continued. "They needed someone who understood the architecture of commercial title transfers. They needed a licensed executive capable of manually overriding the security flags." Preston took a step back. His polished exterior cracked, revealing the terrified opportunist hiding underneath. Agent Davis pulled a single sheet of paper from the blue folder. He held it up for Preston to see. "This is the back-end server log from your boutique title firm in downtown Miami," I said. "It details the exact routing sequence used to authorize the cash sale of my Brickell condo. The funds did not move automatically. The transaction required a manual escrow clearance." I pointed to the highlighted line of code on the paper Davis held. "That is your unique employee identification token," I stated. "Your digital signature authorized the fraudulent deed override. You pushed the sale through the Florida real estate matrix. You ensured the cash vanished into the Cayman holding account before the federal freeze took effect. You did not just marry into the stolen money, Preston. You helped steal it." The blood vanished from Preston's face. His jaw went slack. The confident junior executive evaporated, leaving behind a man staring at the absolute destruction of his future. He realized he traded his freedom for a lavish wedding party and a cut of the illicit proceeds. He froze mid-step. His expensive leather shoes remained rooted to the damp concrete. He looked at Agent Davis, searching for a loophole, a negotiation tactic, or a sliver of leniency. He found a stone wall. Agent Davis did not blink. He did not raise his voice. He closed the blue folder and tucked it under his arm. He reached to the back of his belt and unclipped a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. The metallic clink of the chain resonated in the quiet pavilion. Davis stepped forward, closing the distance between himself and my sister's former fiancé. Preston Davis said, his baritone voice steady and unyielding, You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. He read the Miranda rights with calm, rhythmic precision, right next to the bowl of spilled potato salad. The metallic click of the handcuffs securing Preston's wrists signaled a fundamental shift in the atmosphere under the pavilion. This was no longer a theoretical threat or an uncomfortable family dispute. Federal law enforcement was actively detaining a member of their inner circle. The illusion of safety shattered completely. Preston did not fight. He slumped forward, his custom-tailored suit suddenly looking loose and unkempt. Agent Davis guided him toward the edge of the concrete pad, instructing him to stand quietly while the situation resolved. Harper remained frozen, watching the man she intended to marry transform into a federal suspect in the span of 3 minutes. The remaining 39 relatives instinctively took a collective step backward. They physically distanced themselves from Richard and Brenda, creating a wide, empty semicircle around my parents. The crowd resembled a jury that had just heard the final damning piece of testimony. Aunt Vivian did not retreat. Vivian is the older sister of my father, Richard. She operates a highly successful chain of cosmetic dental clinics stretching from Naples to Fort Myers. She resides in a gated community, plays tennis at an exclusive country club, and serves on the board of 3 local charities. Vivian built her empire through ruthless efficiency and an absolute intolerance for incompetence. She possesses the authentic wealth and unshakable social standing my mother spent 3 decades desperately trying to imitate. Brenda coveted Vivian's approval more than anything else in the world. Vivian looked down at the ruined deviled egg platter scattered across the concrete. She adjusted her designer glasses. She stepped forward. The sharp heel of her expensive Italian shoe crunched loudly against a piece of broken porcelain. She walked slowly and deliberately until she stood mere inches from my mother. Brenda flinched. The panic radiating from her was palpable. She understood the power dynamics of the family better than anyone. If Vivian defected, the entire social structure would collapse. Brenda would be exiled, stripped of her country club invitations, and banished from the charity luncheons. She would become a pariah. Vivian, my mother, stammered, her voice tight and breathy. Vivian, please, you have to understand. The situation was incredibly complicated. We were trying to navigate a crisis. We had to protect the family from Mia's mess. The cartel, the federal government. We were terrified. Vivian did not exhibit a single trace of sympathy. Her face resembled carved marble. She reached into her pristine leather handbag and retrieved her smartphone. She tapped the screen, illuminating the display. Brenda Vivian said. Her voice was not loud, but it possessed a razor-sharp edge that cut through the humid air. You sat on the white linen sofa in my living room. You drank my imported tea. You looked me directly in the eye and wept. You told me you could not sleep because you imagined your youngest daughter shivering in an alleyway. You told me the local police stopped searching. You said you needed a specialized private investigator to infiltrate the cult holding her hostage. Vivian paused, allowing the words to settle over the crowd. Many of the relatives nodded, remembering similar conversations. I wrote you a check for $15,000, Vivian continued. I handed you that money because I believed a mother was enduring unimaginable agony. I believed I was helping to rescue my niece. My mother reached out a trembling hand, attempting to touch Vivian's arm. Vivian, please. We used the money to keep the business afloat. If Richard's company went under, we would have lost the house. We would have lost everything. We were desperate. Vivian slapped Brenda's hand away with a swift, violent motion. Do not touch me, Vivian snapped. You were not desperate, Brenda. You were greedy. You stole your daughter's life savings to buy a luxury SUV. You funded a lavish wedding at the Ritz-Carlton with stolen real estate proceeds. And you used my $15,000 to pay your country club dues while you knew exactly where Mia was. The color rushed into Brenda's face, staining her cheeks a deep, mottled red. The facade of the resilient, suffering matriarch crumbled. She looked at Richard, silently begging her husband to intervene, to offer a defense or a distraction. Richard stared at his boots, utterly defeated. The enabler recognized a losing battle and refused to engage. Vivian held up her smartphone. She opened her mobile banking application and navigated to the transfer portal. "You stole from your own flesh and blood," Vivian stated, her tone dropping an octave. "And you stole from me. You used my genuine grief to line your own pockets." Vivian tapped the screen, entering a sequence of numbers. She turned the phone around so Brenda could see the glowing display. "You have exactly 5 minutes," Vivian demanded. "You will log into your banking application right now. You will wire $15,000 back into my primary checking account, and you will include a 10% interest penalty for the emotional distress you caused me over the last 5 years. Brenda gasped. Her chest heaved rapidly. "Vivian, we cannot do that. The accounts are tied up. The wedding vendors required massive deposits. We do not have the liquid cash right now. Please, you have to give us time." Vivian lowered the phone. Her expression remained entirely devoid of mercy. "I am not a bank offering a grace period, Brenda. I am a victim of fraud. If that money does not register in my account before this barbecue concludes, I am driving directly to the Naples Police Precinct. I will file a formal complaint for civil fraud and grand larceny. I will hand the detective the canceled check and the videos of your fake prayer vigils." Vivian took a step back, creating physical distance between herself and the woman she now recognized as a criminal. "I will add my civil charges to whatever federal indictment Agent Davis is preparing," Vivian finished. "You will not just face the federal government. You will face me in a state courtroom. And I promise you, Brenda, I employ far better lawyers than you can afford." The relatives under the pavilion watched the exchange in stunned silence. The absolute defection of the family matriarch cemented the reality of the situation. Vivian did not just abandon Brenda, she declared war. She publicly labeled my parents as thieves. The social capital my mother spent her entire life cultivating evaporated in less than 60 seconds. The community sympathy she weaponized against me mutated into profound, aggressive disgust. Brenda was trapped. The federal agent blocked the exit. The forensic documents exposed the theft. The stolen fiancé stood handcuffed in the grass. And now, the wealthiest, most influential member of the family demanded immediate financial restitution under the threat of state prosecution. Brenda looked at the hostile faces surrounding her. The aunts and uncles who previously offered prayers and casseroles now offered nothing but contempt. She was completely cornered by the very social circle she had manipulated for half a decade. And cornered animals always reveal exactly what they are. The crushing weight of Vivian's ultimatum extinguished the final embers of my mother's theatrical grief. The realization that she possessed no escape route, no lingering sympathy, and no remaining social leverage triggered a violent psychological pivot. When a narcissist recognizes their manipulation tactics have failed, they do not surrender. They attack. They burn the stage to the ground and blame the audience for the smoke. Brenda stood in the center of the pavilion, isolated and exposed. She stopped looking at Vivian. She stopped looking at Richard. She locked her eyes entirely on me. The delicate, suffering matriarch vanished. The woman staring back at me possessed a rigid jawline and eyes burning with unadulterated, toxic fury. She unleashed decades of simmering resentment, releasing the genuine, unvarnished truth of how she always viewed her youngest daughter. "You ungrateful little witch," Brenda spat. The venom in her voice startled several relatives, causing them to physically flinch. "You come here wearing your pristine white dress, acting like some holy, avenging angel. You think you are so brilliant, dropping your little folders on the table. You were always a cold, unfeeling robot, Mia. You never cared about this family. You only cared about your spreadsheets and your corporate audits. You never possessed a shred of human warmth." I did not interrupt her. I wanted the 40 witnesses to hear every single word. I wanted them to listen to the unfiltered mechanics of a predator justifying her crimes. "We deserved that money," Brenda shrieked, her voice echoing off the aluminum roof. "We raised you. We fed you. We paid for the roof over your head for 18 years. Do you have any idea what it cost to keep you comfortable? Do you have any idea how much Richard sacrificed for this family while you sat in your high-rise condo judging us?" She pointed a manicured finger at the highlighted bank statements resting on the picnic table. "We took what was owed to us," she declared. "It was our compensation for the absolute hell you put us through. You brought the federal government to our doorstep. You dragged the cartel into our lives. You vanished and left us to clean up your mess. We were entitled to every single cent of that property." There it was, the ultimate abuser logic stripped of all pretense. She did not view the fraudulent sale of my condo as a crime. She viewed it as a delayed invoice for the burden of my existence. She genuinely believed that feeding and housing her own child generated a lifelong, unpayable debt, granting her unrestricted access to my adult assets. The relatives watched in horrified silence. The woman who wept on local television broadcasts begging for the safe return of her troubled child now stood in a public park screaming that she was entitled to her daughter's liquidated estate. I adjusted the thick leather strap of my tote bag, allowing it to settle more comfortably on my shoulder. I looked at the flushed, angry face of the woman who gave birth to me. I felt no anger. I felt no profound sadness. I only felt the cold, precise satisfaction of an auditor finalizing a terminal ledger. "Since you brought up the concept of compensation," I said, my voice dropping to a cool, measured register, "let us discuss the concept of restitution." I took a slow, deliberate step forward, closing the distance between us. Brenda instinctively stiffened, bracing for a physical confrontation that would never arrive. "You claim you took what was owed to you," I continued, keeping my eyes locked on hers. "But thieves rarely stop at basic necessities. They invariably use stolen funds to purchase luxury items to soothe their own insecurities." I raised my right hand and pointed directly at her throat. Resting against the collarbone of her expensive silk blouse was a heavy pendant, a large cushion-cut sapphire surrounded by a halo of small diamonds suspended on a thick white gold chain. "I purchased that necklace for your 50th birthday," I stated, projecting my voice so the crowd heard the specific details. "I saved 3 months of my first corporate bonus to afford the appraisal value. I handed you the velvet box at a steakhouse in Coral Gables. You cried and told me it was the most beautiful thing you ever owned." Brenda's hand flew up to her neck, her fingers defensively clutching the heavy blue stone. "It was a gift," she hissed. "You cannot take back a gift. It belongs to me." "It does belong to you," I agreed, nodding slowly. "Or at least it did until last November." I turned back to the picnic table and opened the second manila folder. I extracted a single sheet of paper bearing the logo of a national insurance underwriter. I held the document up for the crowd to examine. "Last November, you contacted a boutique jewelry appraiser in downtown Naples," I explained. "You requested a reassessment of the sapphire pendant. The stone appreciated in value. The new appraisal listed the replacement cost at $22,000. I tapped the highlighted billing section on the insurance document. "You decided to purchase a premium comprehensive insurance rider for the necklace," I said. "But you did not use the revenue from Richard's pool supply business to pay the annual premium. You paid the insurance company using a direct routing transfer from the offshore Cayman holding account, the exact same account containing the fraudulent proceeds from the sale of my Brickell condo." Brenda's fingers gripped the sapphire tighter. Her knuckles turned white. "You used stolen illicit funds to maintain and insure the jewelry I bought you," I concluded. "You commingled clean assets with dirty money." I looked over my shoulder and nodded to the federal agent standing near the handcuffed fiancé. Agent Davis stepped forward. His expression remained an impenetrable mask of professional authority. He approached my mother, stopping less than an arm's length away. "Ma'am," Agent Davis said, his baritone voice commanding the immediate attention of the pavilion. "Under the statutes of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, any personal property maintained, insured, or upgraded using illicit funds is subject to immediate federal seizure." Brenda's eyes widened in sheer panic. "You cannot be serious," she stammered, taking a step backward. "This is my jewelry. It was a birthday present." Agent Davis did not engage in a debate regarding the sentimentality of the item. He operated strictly within the boundaries of federal law. "That piece of jewelry is now classified as an asset purchased with illicit funds," Davis stated firmly. "Please remove the necklace and hand it to me immediately. If you refuse to comply, I will consider it obstruction of a federal asset seizure, and you will be detained." The pavilion fell dead silent. The only sound was the distant hum of traffic from the nearby highway and the rustle of the oak leaves in the humid breeze. Brenda looked at the relatives. She looked at Vivian, who offered nothing but a cold, dismissive glare. She looked at Richard, who remained staring at the concrete, entirely unwilling to intervene. She possessed no allies. She possessed no remaining leverage. Her hands trembled violently as she reached behind her neck. She fumbled with the delicate white gold clasp for several agonizing seconds. The metal finally gave way. She pulled the heavy chain forward. The sapphire pendant slid off her collarbone, catching the afternoon sunlight one final time before dropping into the open palm of the waiting federal agent. Agent Davis closed his fist around the jewelry and dropped it into a heavy plastic evidence bag. As the heavy sapphire vanished into the plastic bag, the illusion of the wealthy, respectable matriarch shattered into dust. The grand performance was officially over, leaving behind nothing but a common thief facing the absolute destruction of her empire. The visual impact of the sapphire vanishing into the federal evidence bag broke whatever psychological defense mechanisms my parents still harbored. Brenda stood motionless, her hands hovering awkwardly near her empty collarbone. The social theater she meticulously directed for decades had ended in a brutal public humiliation. But the humiliation was merely the prologue to the total systemic ruin. Agent Davis turned his attention away from my mother. He focused on Richard. My father had remained largely silent throughout the confrontation. He possessed a lifelong habit of retreating to the shadows whenever my mother's aggressive maneuvering sparked a crisis. Richard was a passive enabler. He preferred to reap the benefits of Brenda's ruthless social climbing and financial manipulation while maintaining the outward appearance of a weary, hard-working, blue-collar patriarch. He allowed Brenda to forge the documents and execute the theft, acting as if his lack of direct involvement absolved him of the underlying guilt. He was about to learn that federal conspiracy charges do not differentiate between the architect of a crime and the willing beneficiary. Agent Davis reached back into the leather portfolio he carried. He withdrew a thick, heavy manila envelope sealed with red evidence tape. He stepped toward Richard, holding the package out. "Richard Mason Davis," said his voice, echoing under the aluminum roof. My father hesitated. He looked at the envelope as if it contained a live, explosive device. His calloused hands trembled as he slowly reached out and accepted the heavy package. "These are federal warrants for immediate asset seizure," Davis explained, addressing both Richard and the 40 silent relatives observing the execution. As of 9 o'clock yesterday morning, every single domestic and offshore banking account linked to Richard and Brenda Mason has been frozen by the United States Treasury. You no longer possess liquid capital. Richard's mouth opened, but he failed to produce a sound. He stared at the thick manila envelope, his breathing turning rapid and shallow. The financial paralysis extended far beyond their checking accounts. The federal hammer drops with absolute, indiscriminate force, crushing any infrastructure supported by the stolen funds. Davis continued outlining the scope of the destruction. The corporate management team at the Ritz-Carlton in Naples was notified of the ongoing federal fraud investigation. They immediately canceled the event contract and surrendered the $120,000 deposit directly to the federal government. The wedding is permanently canceled. Harper, who had remained standing near the picnic table, let out a sharp, agonizing wail. The sound was raw and guttural, the noise of a woman watching her meticulously curated luxury lifestyle evaporate into thin air. She sank onto a plastic folding chair, burying her face in her hands. Preston, the handcuffed fiancé, did not look at her. He remained staring blankly at the grass, calculating his own impending legal nightmares. We also dispatched a federal recovery team to the Naples Country Club, Davis stated, glancing briefly at Harper. The luxury Audi SUV purchased with the illicit funds was located in the clubhouse parking lot. It is currently being impounded and towed to a secure federal holding facility. The scope of the ruin finally registered in my father's brain. The frozen accounts meant his pool supply warehouse would default on payroll by Tuesday morning. The canceled wedding humiliated his golden daughter. The impounded vehicle stripped away the final vestige of their manufactured wealth. They were facing imminent total bankruptcy. And the threat of the Delgado cartel still loomed over the specific money laundering charges attached to his business ledgers. Richard Mason operates on a very simple foundational principle. He prioritizes his own survival above all other considerations. He sacrificed his youngest daughter to a violent criminal syndicate because warning her would have exposed his illegal side hustle. Now, facing federal prison and financial destitution, the enabler executed his final, desperate maneuver. The enabler always sacrifices the primary abuser to save themselves. Richard's knees buckled. He collapsed onto the damp concrete pad. His heavy work boots scraped against the pavement. He ignored the ruined deviled eggs and the spilled potato salad littering the ground around him. He looked up at Agent Davis, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. It was her idea, Richard sobbed, his voice breaking into a high, pathetic whine. He raised his right arm and pointed a trembling finger directly at his wife. Brenda planned the whole thing. Richard cried frantically, attempting to shift the entire burden of the federal conspiracy onto the woman he married 30 years ago. I did not want to steal from Mia. Brenda contacted the dirty notary. Brenda forged the signature on the power of attorney. She forced me to file the conservatorship papers. I just signed the cartel invoices because the warehouse was drowning in debt. I did not know how to fix the business. She made me do it. The crowd of relatives recoiled in disgust. The spectacle of a grown man weeping on the ground, desperately throwing his wife under the federal bus to save his own skin, was repulsive. I will testify against her, Richard pleaded, grabbing the crisp crease of Agent Davis's suit trousers. I will tell the prosecutors everything. I will detail exactly how she routed the money offshore. I will give you the dates, the passwords, the contacts. Just please do not take the house. Do not put me in prison. I will cooperate. Agent Davis looked down at the weeping man, grasping his trouser leg. The federal agent did not offer comfort. He did not offer a deal. He simply stepped backward, breaking Richard's grip on his clothing. Brenda stared down at her husband. The woman who had spent decades micromanaging their public image, projecting an aura of an unbreakable, unified partnership, now looked at the man writhing on the concrete. The toxic fury in her eyes intensified, mutating into pure, cold hatred. The unified front shattered into a million jagged pieces. You pathetic coward, Brenda hissed the words, dripping with venom. She did not deny the accusations. She did not attempt to defend her actions or offer a counter-narrative. She simply stared at the man she chose to build a life with, despising him for breaking under the pressure she had manufactured. You weak, useless coward, she repeated, kicking a piece of broken porcelain toward him. I spent my entire life covering up your failures. I built this family, I secured the funding, and the second things get difficult, you roll over and beg like a dog. In 30 seconds, the impenetrable alliance collapsed completely. The couple who had weaponized a community's sympathy, who had hosted prayer vigils while draining their daughters' bank accounts, were now tearing each other apart in the middle of a public park. They were eagerly selling each other out to the highest federal bidder, desperately trying to salvage whatever miserable scraps of freedom remained. They were doing to each other exactly what they had done to me 5 years ago. 2 unmarked black sedans rolled off the paved access road and drove directly onto the manicured grass of the park. The vehicles parked at sharp angles near the edge of the pavilion, blocking any potential exit routes. The heavy doors opened in unison. 2 plainclothes federal agents stepped out into the humid afternoon air. They wore standard-issue windbreakers bearing the Federal Bureau of Investigation insignia across the back panels. They did not rush. They did not draw weapons or shout commands. This was an administrative takedown, cold, devastating, and entirely routine. The stark contrast between my parents' manufactured high drama and the bored, mechanical efficiency of the federal justice system underscored the reality of the moment. The government did not care about country club reputations or suburban social hierarchies. The government only cared about wire fraud and racketeering statutes. The first agent approached my father. Richard remained kneeling on the damp concrete, staring blankly at the scattered remains of the ruined potato salad. He was still quietly weeping, muttering broken promises about cooperating with prosecutors. The agent reached down and gripped Richard by the upper arm, hauling him to his feet with effortless force. Richard offered no physical resistance. His shoulders slumped forward, his chest caving inward as the agent spun him around. The metallic ratchet of the steel handcuffs echoed sharply under the aluminum roof. The agent recited the Miranda warning in a flat, monotone voice, checking a box on a mental to-do list. Richard stumbled as he was guided toward the back seat of the first sedan, a broken enabler facing the consequences of his own passive cowardice. The second agent walked toward my mother. Brenda watched her husband being loaded into the federal vehicle. She realized her empire was officially liquidated. She possessed no remaining allies, no hidden funds, and no audience willing to endure another performance. Yet her pathological vanity refused to let her collapse. She took a slow, deep breath, straightening her spine. She smoothed the wrinkles from the fabric of her expensive silk blouse. She lifted her chin, tilting her head at an angle designed to project resilient dignity. She held her wrists out in front of her, offering them to the approaching agent, as if she were waiting for a bracelet rather than a pair of iron restraints. The agent ignored her posture. He roughly turned her around and pulled her arms behind her back. The metal clicked into place, securing her wrists tight against her lower spine. The agent grasped her elbow and steered her toward the second waiting vehicle. Their path led them directly past the spot where I stood. Brenda slowed her pace as she approached me. The agent tugged her arm, but she planted her expensive Italian shoes on the concrete, forcing a momentary halt. She turned her head and looked into my eyes. The facade of the heartbroken mother was entirely gone. The woman staring at me radiated pure, concentrated malice. "You are dead to me," Brenda spat. Her voice carried a venomous hiss, intended to inflict a final emotional wound. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or offer an angry rebuttal. I simply looked at the handcuffs binding her wrists. I looked at the white linen dress I wore. I felt the humid breeze sweeping away the last remnants of the suffocating control she once held over my life. "I have been legally dead to you for 5 years, Brenda," I replied, my tone steady and calm. "Enjoy federal prison." The agent pushed her forward, breaking our eye contact. He guided her into the back of the sedan and slammed the heavy door shut. I turned my attention back to the pavilion. The 40 relatives who had gathered for a summer reunion were silently packing their vehicles. Nobody spoke. Nobody lingered to offer comfort or ask further questions. Aunt Vivian climbed into the driver's seat of her luxury sedan and drove away without a backward glance. The social exile my mother feared most was executed in less than 10 minutes. Preston was loaded into the front passenger seat of the first vehicle. He kept his head bowed, hiding his face from the departing crowd. That left Harper. My older sister sat alone on a cheap plastic folding chair near the edge of the empty buffet tables. She was entirely stripped of the synthetic reality she constructed. Her wealthy fiancé was facing a federal indictment. Her luxury Audi SUV was impounded by the Treasury Department. Her lavish destination wedding was canceled. Her stolen inheritance was seized. She possessed no job, no savings, and no enablers left to fund her ignorance. I slung the heavy black leather tote bag over my shoulder. I walked past her toward the parking lot. I did not offer her a hand. I did not offer a lecture. There is an age where turning a blind eye becomes a deliberate choice, and Harper made hers years ago. I left her sitting alone in the quiet park. 8 months have passed since that Sunday afternoon in Naples. The federal justice system moves with grinding, inevitable certainty. Richard recognized the impossibility of his situation and immediately accepted a plea deal. He provided the prosecution with exhaustive details regarding the Delgado Syndicate money laundering operation and testified openly against his wife. In exchange for his cooperation, the judge sentenced him to 7 years in a minimum security federal camp. Brenda refused to negotiate. Her narcissism convinced her she could manipulate a civilian jury the same way she manipulated her neighbors. She took her case to trial. She claimed she acted under duress. She claimed Richard forced her to forge the documents. The jury reviewed the financial ledgers, the offshore routing records, and the premium insurance rider for the sapphire necklace. They deliberated for less than 3 hours. The judge handed down a definitive sentence. Brenda is currently serving 12 years in a federal penitentiary in Tallahassee. The unraveling of their financial fraud required meticulous legal intervention. I worked alongside a team of federal prosecutors and property attorneys to execute a quiet title action. The Miami-Dade Probate Court reviewed the backdated power of attorney and the corrupted notary stamp belonging to Marcus Thorne. The judge officially voided the fraudulent deed transfer. The commercial title insurance policy covered the financial losses of the anonymous cash buyer. The physical property reverted to its rightful owner. The United States Treasury liquidated the seized assets. The impounded Audi SUV was sold at a federal auction. The sapphire necklace was dismantled and sold to a wholesale jeweler. The offshore Cayman accounts were repatriated. Every single cent of my stolen $85,000 savings was fully restored to my primary domestic accounts. Harper was forced to move out of her expensive leased apartment. With no college degree and a tarnished reputation, she struggled to secure employment. She currently works as a front desk receptionist at one of Aunt Vivian's dental clinics. Vivian hired her strictly out of family obligation, paying her a minimum hourly wage. Harper takes the public bus to work every morning. I move back to South Florida. I unlock the door to my Brickell condo on a Tuesday morning. The air inside felt stale, but the gray ceramic tiles and the dark oak cabinets remained exactly as I left them 5 years ago. I spent a week cleaning the space, replacing the furniture, and reclaiming the sanctuary I built through years of grueling corporate audits. The Delgado Syndicate is a fractured memory. The hitmen are incarcerated. The threats are neutralized. My true legal name is reinstated across all federal and state registries. I am no longer a ghost hiding in a freezing Midwestern city. It is a warm, bright morning in Miami. I am sitting on my glass balcony overlooking the sprawling skyline and the vast blue expanse of Biscayne Bay. A fresh mug of black coffee rests on the small metal table beside me. The ocean breeze carries the faint scent of salt and blooming hibiscus. I open my laptop and review the quarterly tax structures for a new portfolio of corporate clients. My mind is sharp, clear, and entirely unburdened. Being the family scapegoat trains you to survive the dark. But when you finally bring your receipts into the light, you don't have to raise your voice. You just let the documents speak. The dust has settled over the ruins of the Mason family. The federal prison doors have locked, the illicit assets have been liquidated, and the stolen condo overlooking Biscayne Bay has been reclaimed. Yet when I sit on my balcony and watch the morning sun reflect off the Miami skyline, my mind frequently drifts away from the forensic accounting and the legal mechanics of the betrayal. I find myself looking past the wire transfers and the forged documents, searching instead for the invisible fractures that eventually brought a family to total systemic collapse. How does a mother reach a point where she can stand in her living room, weeping for a camera, while actively draining the life savings of the child she claims to mourn? How does a father remain silent while his youngest daughter is banished into federal exile, hunted by a cartel, just to protect his own suburban comfort? The answer is not found in a sudden explosion of malice. Families do not break overnight. They erode over decades, worn away by 1,000 quiet failures in parenting, honesty, and emotional awareness. In traditional American culture, there is an immense, unspoken pressure to project a flawless image. The sprawling colonial house, the luxury vehicles in the driveway, the prestigious country club memberships, and the destination weddings serve as the ultimate markers of success. We are taught to pursue this version of the American dream with relentless determination. But when the pursuit of the image supersedes the integrity of the home, the family ceases to be a safe harbor. It becomes a public relations firm. Richard and Brenda Mason did not raise children. They curated assets. They evaluated their daughters based entirely on utility. Harper, with her effortless charm and social grace, was the golden child. She was the pristine extension of our mother's ego, the beautiful prop meant to secure their status among the Naples elite. But in their desperate desire to spoil her, to shield her from the realities of hard work and financial boundaries, they fundamentally failed her. True parental guidance requires the courage to say no. It requires teaching a child the value of resilience, accountability, and the heavy cost of maintaining integrity. By subsidizing her life with stolen money and rewarding her willful ignorance, they did not love Harper. They crippled her. When the artificial foundation finally cracked, Harper was left sitting alone in a park, entirely unequipped to survive a world that demanded competence instead of a smile. Then there was the scapegoat. I was the hyper-competent, quiet worker. I required no financial assistance and demanded no emotional labor from them. Because I was self-sufficient, they assumed I was immune to pain. Because I did not loudly ask for their protection, they decided they did not owe it to me. This is the great tragedy of a family lacking emotional awareness. When parents fail to see the unique vulnerabilities of their strong children, they begin to treat those children as emotional and financial shock absorbers. My parents grew so accustomed to my independence that they forgot I was their daughter. I became a resource to be extracted. When my life was threatened by a violent syndicate, my father did not feel the primal, protective instinct that should drive a parent to stand between their child and danger. Instead, he calculated his own liability. He chose his own survival. Family responsibility is not a passive title you acquire simply by providing food and shelter. It is an active, daily commitment to fairness and profound honesty. It means fostering an environment where truth is valued above comfort and where love is not distributed as a reward for maintaining a convenient illusion. Had Richard possessed the moral courage to confess his money laundering when I first audited the logistics firm, he would have faced severe legal consequences, but he would have retained his role as a father. Had Brenda possessed the emotional depth to value her children over her country club status, she would never have touched the forged power of attorney. They traded their fundamental duty as parents for a temporary lease on a luxury lifestyle. They won the neighborhood's sympathy for a few short years, only to lose their freedom, their legacy, and their children forever. The story of the Mason family is a dark reflection of what happens when the external performance of a family overtakes its internal truth. It is a cautionary tale about the corrosive danger of the golden child and scapegoat dynamic, and a stark reminder that children are highly observant. We see the discrepancies. We notice who is protected and who is sacrificed. We absorb the silent lessons about what our parents truly value. And sometimes, the children who are taught to survive entirely on their own learn those lessons far too well. If this story resonates with the quiet corners of your own history, if you have ever recognized the harsh reality of conditional love, or found yourself carrying the heavy, unspoken burdens of your family's secrets, you are not navigating that dark water alone. There is profound power in finally acknowledging the truth. Join our community and follow the channel or a vengeance. Subscribe to hear more stories of resilience, where the invisible finally find their voice, boundaries are drawn in permanent ink, and the truth ultimately balances the scales. As I finish my coffee and watch the city below wake up to a new day, I leave you with a question to carry into your own life. Look closely at the dynamics playing out across your own dinner tables, during your own holiday gatherings, and within the quiet moments of your home. Are the foundations of your family built on mutual respect, unwavering honesty, and a genuine understanding of who your children are? Or are they built on the fragile, temporary bricks of obligation and outward appearances? We all tell stories about who we are to the outside world. But when the lights go out, the applause fades, and the documents are laid bare on the table, the only thing that remains is the truth of how we treated the people who trusted us most. And sometimes the silence of that truth is the loudest sound you will ever hear.